The conference room fell silent, except for the sound of rain tapping against the tall windows. 23 people sat around a mahogany table that had been custom-built for occasions like this. Estate planning meetings, will readings, the formal distribution of wealth accumulated over 3 generations. Everyone wore dark suits or conservative dresses. Everyone except him. He sat at the far end, near the door, in jeans and a plain button-down shirt that looked like it had been ironed at home. His hands rested on his knees. He didn't touch the water glasses set before each chair. He didn't speak. For 40 minutes, he simply listened as the attorney outlined the basic structure of Eleanor Whitmore's estate. $13 million in liquid assets. 3 properties, including the family mansion in Charlottesville, investment portfolios, antique collections, a private vineyard in the Shenandoah Valley. When the attorney paused to take a drink of water, the man raised his hand slightly, hesitantly, as if asking permission to speak in a classroom. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. "I have a question about the inheritance." The room didn't explode with laughter. It was quieter than that, more insidious. A few people smiled and looked down at their papers. Someone in the middle of the table exhaled through their nose in what might have been amusement or annoyance. Eleanor's oldest grandson, Bradley, leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest, one eyebrow raised. The attorney, Martin Kessel, adjusted his glasses. "I'm sorry. Could you state your name and relationship to the deceased?" "David Colson," the man said. "I'm Eleanor's son." This time, the reaction was more direct. Bradley laughed outright. Eleanor's daughter, Patricia, turned in her seat and stared at David with a mixture of confusion and irritation. Eleanor had 2 children. Patricia said coldly, "I'm one of them. My brother Richard is the other. He died in 2008. There is no 3rd child." David didn't respond immediately. He looked at the attorney, who was flipping through a thick folder with increasing urgency. "I understand this is confusing," David said, "but I believe there are documents that explain my situation." "This is absurd," Bradley said, standing up. "Mom, do we really have to sit here and listen to this? Some random guy walks in here claiming to be Grandma's secret son, and we're supposed to just sit down." "Bradley." The voice came from the head of the table. "Margaret Whitmore, Eleanor's sister, and the eldest living family member, at 81 years old." Her tone left no room for argument. Bradley sat. Margaret looked at David with an expression that was unreadable, not hostile, not welcoming, just steady and deliberate. "Mr. Kessel, are you aware of this claim?" The attorney cleared his throat. "There is a sealed section of Mrs. Whitmore's will that was to be opened only in the presence of all named beneficiaries. I was instructed not to discuss its contents until this meeting." "Then open it," Margaret said. What no one in that room understood yet was that Eleanor Whitmore had spent the last 6 months of her life preparing for this exact moment. She had known it would be painful. She had known it would fracture relationships that were already fragile. And she had decided, in the clarity that sometimes comes near the end of life, that the truth mattered more than comfort. The truth always does. To understand what happened in that conference room on the 9th of October, you need to go back 57 years. To a time when Eleanor Whitmore was not the dignified matriarch of a Virginia dynasty, but a 22-year-old woman named Eleanor Hastings, working as a secretary in a law firm in Richmond, and trying to figure out how to survive in a world that offered women very few choices. Eleanor Hastings met Jonathan Whitmore in the spring of 1960. A was 31, a junior partner at the firm, recently divorced, and according to every account, charming in a way that made people trust him even when they shouldn't. Eleanor was smart, organized, and quietly ambitious. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Norfolk. Her father was a machinist. her mother took in sewing. Eleanor was the first person in her family to finish high school, let alone work in a professional office. Jonathan noticed her. He started asking her to work late on his cases. Then he started driving her home. Then he started taking her to dinner. They were engaged by July, married in September. Patricia was born in 1968. Richard came 2 years later. From the outside, they looked like the ideal American family. Jonathan's career flourished. They moved to Charlottesville. They bought the mansion on Belmonte Avenue. Eleanor left the workforce to manage the household and raise the children, which was what was expected of her. But before Patricia, before the mansion, before Eleanor Hastings became Eleanor Whitmore, there was a pregnancy. It happened in the summer of 1965, a full year before she met Jonathan. Eleanor had been dating a man named Thomas Colson. He worked in construction. He was 24. They had been together for almost a year when Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. Thomas wanted to get married. Eleanor wanted to finish night school and get a better job. They argued. The relationship deteriorated. By the time Eleanor was 3 months along, Thomas had left Richmond for a job in North Carolina. He sent 2 letters. She didn't respond to either of them. On February 14th, 1966, Eleanor gave birth to a son at a Catholic charity hospital in Richmond. She named him David. 3 days later, she signed the papers to place him for adoption. This was not unusual for the time. Unmarried mothers faced enormous social stigma. Women were routinely told that giving up a child was the responsible, moral choice. Eleanor was young, broke, and alone. The social worker told her that David would go to a good family, that he would have opportunities she couldn't provide, that this was an act of love. Eleanor signed. She left the hospital. She never spoke about it again, except she didn't forget. Not ever. Not for one single day across 57 years. She met Jonathan 4 months later. She never told him about David. When she got pregnant with Patricia, she felt a complicated mixture of joy and guilt that she couldn't articulate to anyone. She loved her children. She was a devoted mother, but there was always a third child somewhere in the world, living a life she knew nothing about. In 2019, when Eleanor was 76 years old and recently widowed, she hired a private investigator. His name was Leonard Marsh. He specialized in adoption searches. Eleanor told him she wanted to know if her son was alive, if A was well, and if he would be willing to meet her. She didn't want to disrupt his life. She just wanted to know. Leonard found David in 6 weeks. David Colson was 53 years old. He lived in Harrisonburg, Virginia, about an hour from Charlottesville. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a public high school. He was married to a woman named Jennifer. They had 2 children, both grown. David had been raised by Robert and Cheryl Colson, a couple who had adopted him as an infant. They were kind people. They gave him a stable, loving home. Robert died in 2004. Cheryl died in 2016. David had always known he was adopted. His parents never hid it from him. When he turned 18, he requested his original birth certificate from the state of Virginia. He learned his birth mother's name, Eleanor Hastings. He thought about searching for her, but he didn't want to intrude. He assumed she had moved on, built a new life, maybe didn't want to be found. When Leonard Marsh contacted him, David was shocked. And then he was curious. And then, despite his hesitation, he agreed to meet. Eleanor and David met for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in March of 2020. At a quiet coffee shop in Staunton, a neutral location halfway between their homes. Eleanor had brought a folder of photographs, pictures of herself as a young woman, pictures of Thomas Colson that she had kept hidden in a box in her attic for decades. medical records, the original adoption papers. They talked for 3 hours. David was polite, cautious, but not cold. Eleanor cried more than once. She apologized. She explained the circumstances. She told him she had thought about him constantly. She asked if he hated her. David said he didn't. He said he had a good life. He said he understood that she had been young and alone and that the world had been different then. They agreed to meet again. Over the next 3 years, Eleanor and David built a careful, fragile relationship. They met every few months, always in private, always discreetly. Eleanor never told Patricia or Richard. She told herself it was because she didn't want to hurt them, but the truth was more complicated. She was ashamed. She was afraid of their judgment. She was afraid they would feel betrayed, but she also began to feel that her silence was a betrayal of David. He existed. He was her son, and by keeping him a secret, she was erasing him all over again. In January of 2023, Eleanor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She was given 6 to 12 months. She chose not to pursue aggressive treatment. She was 80 years old. She was tired, and she decided that if she was going to die, she was going to die having told the truth. She updated her will in March. She met with Martin Kessel and gave him explicit instructions. David was to be included as a beneficiary. He was to be invited to the reading. His identity was to be revealed to the family in a controlled setting, with legal documentation to support the claim. Eleanor tried, twice, to tell Patricia and Richard herself. Both times she lost her nerve. Richard was dealing with his own health problems. Patricia was busy with her career and her children and seemed perpetually annoyed with Eleanor for reasons Eleanor didn't fully understand. So, Eleanor wrote letters instead, personal letters to each of her children and grandchildren, to be delivered by the attorney after the will was read. Letters that explained David's existence, her reasons for the adoption, and her hope that the family would welcome him. She died on September 2nd, 2023, in hospice care at the Charlottesville mansion. Patricia and Richard were both present. David was not. Eleanor had asked him not to come, not wanting to force an introduction under those circumstances. He respected her wishes. The funeral was held 4 days later. 200 people attended. The obituary made no mention of David. And now, 5 weeks later, 23 people sat in a conference room and watched as Martin Kessel broke the seal on a manila envelope marked "Confidential," to be opened only in the presence of all beneficiaries. If you're the kind of person who finds these family mysteries as compelling as I do, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Martin Kessel removed 3 documents from the envelope. The first was a DNA test. Eleanor had asked David to take a paternity test through a private lab in 2020. The results confirmed with 99.7% certainty that Eleanor Whitmore was David Coulson's biological mother. The report included a comparison to a sample Eleanor had provided. The second document was a notarized statement from Leonard Marsh, the private investigator, detailing his search process and confirming David's identity and adoption records. The third document was a letter from Eleanor, handwritten, dated March 15th, 2023. Martin, read the letter aloud. To my beloved family, by the time you hear these words, you will be gone, and I hope at peace. I am writing this letter because I owe you the truth, and I owe David the acknowledgement he has never received. In February of 1966, before I met your father, before I became the woman you knew, I gave birth to a son and placed him for adoption. His name is David Coulson. For 57 years, I carried the pain of that decision in silence. 3 years ago, I found him. We have built a relationship, and he has shown me grace I did not deserve. I have included David in my will not to diminish what you receive, but to correct an absence. He is your brother. He is your uncle. He is part of this family, whether we acknowledged it or not. I ask that you treat him with the kindness and respect he has shown me. I love you all. I am sorry for the secrets. Forgive me if you can. Eleanor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Patricia was the first to speak. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. She had 50 years to tell us about this. And she waits until she's dead. She tried to tell you, David said quietly. She told me she tried. Oh, she told you, Patricia snapped. How nice. She told you all about us, I'm sure. What else did she tell you? That we're terrible people, that we don't deserve her money. She'd never said anything like that. Then what do you want? Why are you here? Because your mother invited me. Because she wanted me to be part of this. Bradley stood up again. This is a shakedown. This is some guy who found out Grandma was sick and convinced her he was her long-lost son so he could— There's a DNA test, Martin interrupted firmly. Mr. Coulson is telling the truth. He is Eleanor's biological son. Margaret spoke again, her voice calm but edged with something hard. What is his share? Martin hesitated. Then he turned to a specific page in the will. Eleanor divided her estate into 4 parts. 25% to Patricia, 25% to Richard's heirs, since Richard predeceased her, 25% to David, and 25% to a charitable foundation she established for adoption support services. Unbelievable, Patricia said. Unfucking believable. Patricia. Margaret said sharply. Don't Patricia me. Aunt Margaret, this man gets $3 million because he happened to be born 57 years ago and given away. He's been in her life for 3 years, and he gets the same share as me. David stood up. I don't want to fight with you. I didn't ask for this. Your mother made this decision, not me. Then refuse it, Patricia said. If you're such a good person, refuse the inheritance. David looked at her for a long moment. Why should I? Because you're not part of this family? Your mother thought I was. My mother was dying and sentimental and clearly not thinking straight. Martin held up a hand. Senor Patterson, I understand this is difficult, but Eleanor was of sound mind when she made these decisions. She was evaluated by 2 independent physicians as part of the estate planning process. This will is legal and binding. Then we'll contest it. On what grounds? Undue influence. Fraud. I don't know. You're the lawyer. You figured it out. There are no grounds, Martin said quietly. I'm sorry. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Bradley and 2 of his cousins started arguing with David. Patricia demanded copies of every document. Margaret sat in silence, watching everything with those steady, unreadable eyes. David left the building 20 minutes later, walking out into the rain without an umbrella. A reporter from a local news station was waiting in the parking lot, somehow having gotten word that something dramatic was happening. David didn't answer her questions. He got into his 12-year-old Honda and drove home. What he didn't know was that Patricia had already called her lawyer, a man named Gordon Vickers, a bulldog litigator who specialized in estate disputes. Patricia wanted the will overturned. She wanted David removed. She wanted her full inheritance, and she was willing to destroy her mother's reputation to get it. The first article appeared online 3 days later. It was published on a Virginia legal blog with a modest but dedicated readership. The headline read, Charlottesville heiress's secret son inherits millions. Family cries foul. The article laid out the basic facts. Eleanor Whitmore, widow of prominent attorney Jonathan Witt had died, leaving an estate worth over $30 million. A previously unknown son, David Colson, had appeared at the will reading and been awarded a 25% share. Family members were questioning the legitimacy of the claim. The article included a quote from an anonymous source close to the family. "This man came out of nowhere. He preyed on an elderly, dying woman. It's elder abuse, plain and simple." David didn't see the article until a friend texted him the link. He read it sitting in his kitchen, his wife Jennifer looking over his shoulder. "They're calling you a con artist." Jennifer sighed. "I know. Are you going to respond?" "I don't know. What would I say? The truth." David shook his head. "The truth doesn't matter to them. They've already decided who I am." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the story grew. A Richmond newspaper picked it up, then a Virginia lifestyle magazine, then a regional television station. Each version of the story became more sensational. Secret love child, deathbed manipulation, family torn apart by greed. David stopped reading the coverage. He hired his own attorney, a woman named Alice Brennan, who specialized in estate law. Alice told him what he already knew. The will was solid. The DNA test was conclusive. Patricia could contest it, but she would lose. "The problem," Alice said, "is that contesting a will is a public process. They're going to drag this out. They're going to make it ugly. You need to be prepared for that." "I am prepared." "Are you?" "Because they're going to go after your mother. They're going to say she was manipulated, that she wasn't competent, that you coerced her. They're going to paint her as a weak, confused old woman. Are you okay with that?" David was quiet for a long time. "She wasn't weak. She was one of the strongest people I ever met." "Then you need to be willing to fight for her." The case went to court in January of 2024. Patricia's legal team filed a petition to invalidate the portions of the will related to David, arguing undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The hearing was scheduled for March. In the months leading up to the trial, both sides engaged in discovery. This meant depositions, document requests, and interrogatories. Patricia's lawyers demanded every email, letter, and text message exchanged between Eleanor and David. They demanded phone records. They demanded testimony from Leonard Marsh, the private investigator. They demanded medical records showing Eleanor's mental state in the months before her death. David complied with everything. He had nothing to hide. The correspondence between him and Eleanor was tender, cautious, and utterly innocent. They talked about his childhood, his career, his kids. Eleanor's memories of Thomas Colson, her regrets about the adoption. There was no discussion of money until Eleanor herself brought it up. And Devent and David had discouraged it. In one email from July of 2022, Eleanor wrote, "I want you to know that I've updated my will to include you. You may not want this, and I understand if you feel uncomfortable. But you are my son, and you deserve to be recognized as such." David's response, "You don't owe me anything. I just appreciate getting to know you." Eleanor's reply, "That's exactly why I want to do this." The emails didn't help Patricia's case. If anything, they undermined it. They showed a woman who was clear-minded, intentional, and motivated by love, not manipulation. But Patricia's lawyers found something else, something that changed the entire trajectory of the case. In late February, during a deposition of Margaret Whitmore, Patricia's attorney asked a seemingly routine question. "Were you aware of any other significant relationships or secrets in Eleanor's life that might be relevant to this case?" Margaret was silent for almost a full minute. The court reporter's hands hovered over the keys. The attorney waited. "Finally," Margaret said, Eleanor wasn't the only one with secrets. The attorney leaned forward. "Can you elaborate?" "Jonathan had an affair. It lasted 4 years. Eleanor knew about it. She chose to stay." This revelation didn't directly impact the validity of the will, but it did something else. It gave Patricia's legal team a narrative. They began to argue that Eleanor's decision to include David wasn't about fairness or love, but about revenge. But Eleanor, still bitter about Jonathan's infidelity decades later, wanted to punish Patricia and Richard by elevating an outsider. That the will was an act of spite. It was absurd, but it was persuasive in the way that emotionally charged narratives often are. The affair Margaret referenced had taken place in the late 1970s. Jonathan had been involved with a paralegal at his firm for nearly 4 years. Eleanor had discovered it in 1981, when she found hotel receipts in Jonathan's briefcase. She confronted him. Apollo, he said, he ended the affair. They stayed together, in part because Eleanor believed in the vows she had taken, and in part because divorce in 19, especially for a woman with 2 young children and no recent work history, was financially and socially devastating. Eleanor had confided in Margaret at the time. No one else knew. Not Patricia. Not Richard. Eleanor and Jonathan rebuilt their marriage, or at least the appearance of it. Jonathan never strayed again, as far as anyone knew. He became, by all accounts, a devoted husband in his later years. But now, 40 years later, that old wound was being weaponized. Patricia's attorneys began painting a picture of Eleanor as a bitter, resentful woman who had never forgiven her husband and who used her will to express anger she couldn't voice in life. They argued that including David was a way to diminish Patricia and Richard, to signal that they, the children of Jonathan, were less important than David, the child from before Jonathan. It was a psychological argument, not a legal one. But trials are as much about emotion as evidence. David sat through the depositions and felt sick. This wasn't what Eleanor had wanted. She had wanted reconciliation, acknowledgement, healing. Instead, her most painful memories were being dissected in a conference room by lawyers billing $400 an hour. The trial began on March 11th, 2024. It was held in the Circuit Court of Charlottesville. Judge Andrea Hollis presiding. The courtroom was open to the public, and on the first day, it was nearly full. Extended family members, friends of the Whitmores, journalists, a few curious locals who had followed the story in the news. Patricia's lead attorney, Goran Vikas, gave an opening statement that was both polished and ruthless. He acknowledged that David was biologically Eleanor's son. But biology, he argued, does not equal family. David had been absent from Eleanor's life for 54 years. He appeared only when she was old, sick, and vulnerable. The timing was suspicious. The relationship was superficial, and the will, drafted in the final months of her life, reflected not Eleanor's true wishes, but the influence of a stranger who had inserted himself into her grief. Alice Brennan, David's attorney, responded with a quieter but no less forceful argument. Eleanor had been a competent, intelligent woman who made a deliberate choice. She had spent 3 years getting to know her son. She had been evaluated by physicians and found mentally sound. She had explained her reasoning in writing. The will was valid. The family's pain was understandable, but it did not justify overturning a woman's final wishes. The trial lasted 6 days. The testimony was brutal. Patricia took the stand and spoke about her mother with a mixture of love and anger. She described Eleanor as a devoted mother who would always put her children first. She described the shock of learning about David. She cried when she talked about feeling betrayed, about realizing that her mother had kept this enormous secret for her entire life. "I don't know who my mother was anymore," Patricia sighed. "I thought I knew her. I thought we were close." And then I find out she had this whole other life, this whole other child, and she never trusted me enough to tell me. It makes me question everything. Gordon Vickers asked, "Do you believe your mother was manipulated by Mr. Coulson?" I don't know what else to think. She was dying, she was vulnerable, and he was there. David's attorney cross-examined her gently but effectively. "Mrs. Patterson, did your mother ever mention feeling manipulated by anyone in the last year of her life?" "No." "Did she ever express regret about updating her will?" "Not to me." "Did she ever tell you she didn't want to include David?" "She never told me about David at all." "So you have no actual evidence that she was manipulated. You just don't agree with her decision." Patricia's jaw tightened. "I know my mother would never have done this if she was thinking clearly." "Your mother was evaluated by 2 physicians who stated she was of sound mind. Do you have medical training that contradicts their findings?" "No." "Then isn't it possible that your mother simply made a choice you don't like?" Patricia didn't answer. David took the stand on the 4th day. He spoke quietly, carefully. He explained the circumstances of his adoption, his childhood, his decision to meet Eleanor, the nature of their relationship. Gordon Vickers went after him hard. "Mr. Coulson, you're a maintenance supervisor at a public high school. Is that correct?" "Yes." "What's your annual salary?" "About $52,000. And you're about to inherit over $3 million. If the will is upheld, yes. That's quite a windfall for someone in your financial position. I didn't seek this out, but you accepted it. Mrs. Whitmore wanted me to have it. Or so you say. The only person who could confirm that is conveniently dead." Alice objected. The judge sustained it. But the implication hung in the air. Vickers continued. "You met Mrs. Whitmore in March of 2020. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And she was diagnosed with cancer in January of 2023. Correct?" "Yes." "Yes. So you had been in her life for less than 3 years when she got sick." "That's correct." "Isn't it true that you increased the frequency of your visits after her diagnosis?" "We saw each other more often." "Yes." "She was dying. I wanted to spend time with her." "How convenient." "It wasn't about money. I cared about her." "You cared about a woman you barely knew." "She was my mother. She gave you up 57 years ago. She chose not to be your mother." David's voice hardened. "She was 22 years old and had no support. She made an impossible choice. That doesn't mean she stopped being my mother." Vickers paused, letting the tension build. "Did you ever ask Mrs. Whitmore to include you in her will?" "No." "Did you ever discuss your financial situation with her?" "Not in detail. But she knew you weren't wealthy, I suppose. And she felt sorry for you." "I don't think that's why she did it." "Then why did she do it, Mr. Coulson?" David looked at him steadily. "Because she wanted to acknowledge me. Because she felt guilty for giving me up. Because she wanted to make things right. Or because she made her feel guilty. I never made her feel anything say coming to me. I didn't seek her out." The cross-examination went on for 2 more hours. Vickers tried to catch David in inconsistencies. He tried to portray him as opportunistic, calculating, cold, but David didn't break. He answered every question honestly. He didn't get defensive. He didn't lash out. By the time he stepped down, even some of Patricia's supporters seemed uncertain. The turning point came on the 5th day, when Martin Kessel, the attorney who drafted the will, testified. Kessel had been Eleanor's lawyer for over 20 years. He had handled the estate planning for both Eleanor and Jonathan. He knew the family well. Alice Brennan asked him to describe Eleanor's mental state in the months before her death. "She was sharp," Kessel said. "Sharper than most people half her age. She knew exactly what she wanted. She asked detailed questions. She reviewed every clause of the will multiple times. There was no confusion, no hesitation. Did she ever express doubt about including Mr. Coulson? No. She was very clear that he was to be treated as her son and given an equal share. Did she explain why? She said it was the right thing to do. She said she had made a mistake 57 years ago and this was her chance to correct it. She seemed coerced or influenced by anyone. Absolutely not. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who could be coerced into anything. Gordon Vickers tried to shake Kessel's testimony on cross-examination, but it didn't work. Kessel was unflappable. He had notes from every meeting. He had contemporaneous emails. He had medical evaluations. The documentation was overwhelming. The final witness was Margaret Whitmore. Margaret was 81 years old, but she walked to the stand with the posture of someone 20 years younger. She took the oath and sat down, her hands folded in her lap. Alice Brennan approached carefully. Margaret was technically a witness for the other side, but Alice suspected there was more to her than Patricia's legal team understood. Mrs. Whitmore, you were Eleanor's older sister, is that correct? Yes. Yes. How would you describe your relationship? Close. We spoke several times a week. We trusted each other. Did Eleanor ever tell you about David? Margaret paused. Yes. She told me about a year before she died. This was news to Patricia, who visibly stiffened in her seat. Alice continued. What did she tell you? She told me that she had a son before she married Jonathan, that she had given him up for adoption, that she had found him and they were building a relationship. She asked me not to tell Patricia or Richard because she wanted to do it herself. How did you respond? I told her. I understood. I told her I thought she was brave. Did she seem confused or manipulated? No. She seemed relieved, like she had been carrying a burden for decades and was finally setting it down. Alice paused. Do you believe David manipulated your sister? Margaret looked directly at Patricia. No. I believe Eleanor made a choice, and I believe it was the right choice. Patricia's face went pale. Gordon Vickers stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Whitmore, you stated in your deposition that Jonathan had an affair. Why did you bring that up? Because you asked if there were other secrets in the family. Do you believe Eleanor included David in the will as revenge against Jonathan? No. Then why mention the affair? Margaret's gaze didn't waver, because this family has spent decades pretending to be something it's not. Perfect. Respectable. United. We're not. We never were. Eleanor knew that, and in the end, she decided honesty mattered more than appearances. Vickers tried to press her further, but Margaret shut him down with calm, devastating precision. She had been a schoolteacher for 40 years. She knew how to handle someone trying to twist her words. By the time she stepped down, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. Closing arguments were delivered on the 6th day. Vickers gave a passionate speech about family loyalty and the sanctity of a mother's bond with the children she raised. Alice Brennan gave a quieter, more measured argument about autonomy, regret, and the right of a dying woman to make peace with her past. Judge Hollis took 2 weeks to issue her ruling. On March 29, 2024, the court found in favor of David Coulson. The will was upheld in its entirety. Patricia's petition was denied. In her written opinion, Judge Hollis stated, while the court is sympathetic to the emotional distress experienced by Mrs. Patterson and the Whitmore family, the evidence overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that Eleanor Whitmore was of sound mind, free from undue influence, and acting in accordance with her own deeply held beliefs when she drafted her final will. The fact that her children disagreed with her choices does not constitute legal grounds to overturn those choices. Patricia did not appeal. Her lawyers advised her that an appeal would be expensive, time-consuming, and almost certainly unsuccessful. David inherited $3,200,000. Patricia received the same. Richard's 3 children split his share. The charitable foundation received its portion. The family fractured completely. Patricia refused to speak to David. Bradley publicly called him a thief. 2 of Eleanor's grandchildren reached out to David privately and apologized for the way he had been treated. But they did so quietly, not wanting to alienate the rest of the family. Margaret remained in contact with David. They met for lunch once every few months. She told him stories about Eleanor as a young woman. She gave him photographs. She treated him, in her quiet, unsentimental way, like family. David used part of his inheritance to pay off his mortgage. He set up college funds for his grandchildren. He donated $50,000 to the high school where he worked, funding a scholarship for students from low-income families. He and Jennifer took a trip to Ireland, something they had talked about for years but never been able to afford. He did not buy a new car. He did not quit his job. He did not move to a bigger house. "I don't need a different life," he told Jennifer. "I just needed to be acknowledged." In June of 2024, David received a package in the mail. It was from Martin Kessel. Inside was a small wooden box with a note. "Eleanor asked me to give this to you after everything was settled. She wanted you to have it." David opened the box. Inside was a silver locket on a thin chain. He opened the locket. On one side was a tiny photograph of Eleanor as a young woman, no more than 20 years old. On the other side was a photograph of a newborn baby. There was a piece of paper folded beneath the locket. David unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. "Eleanor's. David, I wore this every day for 57 years. No one ever asked what was inside. I'm glad you exist. I'm glad I found you. I'm sorry it took so long. Love, Mom." David sat at his kitchen table and cried for the first time since the trial ended. He wore the locket once to Margaret's 82nd birthday party. Patricia was there. She saw the locket. She didn't say anything. She left early. 2 years later, in the summer of 2026, Patricia's husband lost his job. Their financial situation became precarious. Patricia considered reaching out to David, considered asking if they could talk, maybe find some kind of reconciliation. She never did. Bradley started a business that failed within 18 months. He burned through most of his inheritance. He blamed David, though David had nothing to do with it. Margaret died peacefully in her sleep in October of 2027. At the age of 84, her own will left a small bequest to David with a note that said, "You were good to my sister. Thank you." David framed the note and hung it in his office at the high school, next to a photograph of Eleanor. He never met Thomas Coulson, his biological father. Thomas had died in 2017, 2 years before Eleanor found David. But David visited his grave once, in a small cemetery outside of Asheville, North Carolina. He stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but thinking, wondering what kind of man Thomas had been, whether he ever thought about the son he'd never met. David never got an answer to that question. Some things stay unknown. But he got other answers. He got to know his mother, even if only for a few years. He got to hear her voice. He got to understand the choice she made and the pain it cost her. He got to forgive her. And more importantly, he got to tell her she didn't need forgiveness. The inheritance wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about a name on a document, a place at a table, A mother saying, at the end of her life, "You mattered. You matter still." The family laughed when he asked about the inheritance. They stopped laughing when they learned who he was. But the real revelation wasn't his identity. It was theirs. They learned that love is not a finite resource that diminishes when shared. They learned that legitimacy is not determined by who was present, but by who was acknowledged. They learned that a family's carefully constructed image can shatter the moment someone tells the truth. Eleanor Whitmore told the truth. It cost her children's respect, at least temporarily. It cost her the peaceful, dignified legacy she might have had. But it gave David something no amount of money could buy. It gave him a mother who, 57 years late, finally claimed him. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that really mattered.